Hi there. Today we're going to be thinking about what happens to an economy when the government imposes a new tax. And the inspiration for this came from a Parks and Recreation episode, Season 5, Episode 2, Soda Tax. So I've linked to a Wikipedia summary of the episode in the comments, as well as to Crave, where you can go and watch this if you're interested. Now, if you do decide to watch it, I'll warn you that there's about 30 seconds at the beginning that are a little bit fat-phobic. So if this is something that's going to be upsetting to you, I'd say just go ahead and skip that 30 seconds. And I've put timestamps in the comments so that you can do that. Now, to think through the impact that Leslie's soda tax would have on economic activity in Pawnee, we need to know where Pawnee is to begin with. And since I don't have any data on Pawnee, like unemployment or inflation, I'm just going to assume that we're starting from the long run equilibrium. So let's set that up on our aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. Now I really want to go back to basics here. So let's think about what the axes on this graph are. The horizontal axis is going to be output. Okay, and we think of this as real output. So you want to be thinking in terms of units of stuff. Now, there's another way to think about this, which is that output is also equal to income. So everything that is produced in Pawnee gets distributed to Pawnee residents as income, either in the form of wages or in the form of profits or returns on investment. Now, to simplify things, we're going to assume that Pawnee just produces one good. And I'm going to think of this as candy. So if you've ever watched Parks and Rec, you know that there's a big factory in Pawnee called Sweetums that produces a variety of sweets and candy products. So I'm just going to put this all into one product and assume that what's on the y-axis is just the amount of that product that is produced in any given year. Now, of course, Pawnee residents may want to consume something other than that product. They're just going to have to import that from outside the city. On the y-axis here, we're going to have the price level. Now, in an economy with many goods, we would think of this as an average price level, weighting by how important each product is in final demand. Of course, in this economy, it's just going to be the price of that candy product that is produced at Sweetums. Now let's set up our aggregate supply curve. So this supply curve tells us how much Sweetums is willing to sell at any given price level for its product. So to think about the shape of this, let's assume that to produce candy, you're going to need a few things. You're going to need a factory, and that factory is going to need some machines. You're going to need some workers, and you're going to need some raw inputs, so things like high fructose corn syrup, chocolate, nuts, all of this other stuff that goes into the candy product. Now, let's assume that you need a certain number of machines just to be able to produce anything, right? So let's say there's 5 different kinds of machines that you need in order to make this product. So we're going to have those 5 machines in the factory. And let's say you need at least 1 worker per machine if you want to produce at all. Now, let's say if we had 5 workers and 5 machines, they could produce something like 1,000 pieces of candy a day. So anything between 0 and 1,000 pieces of candy per day is going to cost the same for the Sweetums factory. And so they're going to have some price that they require in order to be able to sell it. That's the price that just meets their costs of production. But they're going to be willing to sell anything from 0 to 1,000 pieces of candy a day at that price. And so at low levels of production, we tend to think of the supply curve as being horizontal. Now, let's assume that Sweetums wants to produce more than 1,000 pieces of candy. To do this, it's going to have to add some of its inputs, right? And in particular, it's going to need more workers and more raw materials. Now, the problem here is that when we add more workers, holding the number of machines fixed, we're not going to get a 1-for-1 increase in production, right? So those first 5 workers, they could produce 1,000 units a day. If we add another 5, those extra 5 might only add 800 units a day, right? And that's because they're sharing the machines with those initial workers, and you're gonna have some kind of overlap or inefficiencies as the 2 workers try to share the machine. And so producing the next few hundred units is gonna cost more than it did to produce the first 1,000. And you can tell this story for the next 1,000 units and the next 1,000 after that. And so over some intermediate range of production, we're going to see that each unit costs a little bit more than the last. And this means that Sweetums is going to require a slightly higher price in order to sell an additional unit as we increase the number of units. So in this region, the supply curve is going to be upward sloping. Finally, we're eventually going to hit a point where the factory just really can't produce anymore, right? Even if we added extra workers, it's so crowded, we just wouldn't be able to get any more output out of them at the moment. And this is the region where the aggregate supply curve turns vertical, right? Even if consumers are willing to pay a really, really high price for the product, the factories simply can't produce any more of the candy product. Now, one thing to note about the curve I just described is that this is a short run curve. This is what the firm is willing to produce at a given price with the existing amount of machines and capital that it has, and given the input prices that it faces for labor and for those raw materials I mentioned. Now, of course, if we hit the capacity constraint over the longer run, the firm could choose to build a new factory. In the short run, however, we tend to assume that these, things like factories and machines are hard to adjust instantaneously. The price that Sweetums needs to produce a certain amount of candy is obviously going to be dependent on how much it costs to produce that candy. So say that there's a surge in demand nationally for high fructose corn syrup and that the price for corn syrup goes up. This means that Sweetums is going to have to pay more for one of its primary inputs. And that means that it's going to require a higher price in order to produce the same amount. So when something like that happens, we think of the supply curve as shifting up. This means that the firm is going to require a higher price to produce the same amount of output. You can also think of this as the firm is willing to produce less output at the same price. Now, suppose Sweetum is producing at a really high level of output, really close to that capacity limit. What that probably means is that they're going to be paying their workers overtime, right? So they're the only employer in this economy. It means that the unemployment rate in Pawnee is going to be really low in this case. And they're probably going to be running their machines at above the optimal capacity, right? So machines periodically need to be stocked to be maintained or repaired. But if they're running them all the time, if they want to produce as much as possible, they're not going to be able to stop and do that. So the factory can produce near the capacity threshold for a little while, but they probably can't keep doing it permanently, right? And that's because their machines need a break, their workers need a break. If the unemployment rate is really low, there's going to be some upward pressure on wages. So for a variety of reasons, the output at really high levels is not going to be sustainable in the long run. Conversely, if they're not producing a lot at a given time period, they may not be making full use of all of their resources. There may be some machines that are sitting idle. Their machines may have more downtime than they strictly need. There may be unemployed workers in the economy who are not producing. And so when that happens, we say that the economy is below its capacity. Now, somewhere in between these two extremes is going to be a level of output that is just consistent with using your resources effectively, right? And so in the case of Sweetums, this is going to be the machines are running most of the time, but they're getting just enough time for that maintenance and repair. The workers are working full days. There are enough of them, but they're not working overtime. They're not being pushed to their limit, right? This is the place where if the factory was always producing at this level, it would be sustainable. They'd be able to keep it up, but they're using all of their resources effectively. And we call this the long run aggregate supply. Now, we tend to think of this as a specific level of output, and we just draw it as a vertical line on the graph. Okay? And so at any given moment, the level of output in the economy may be above or below this, but in the long run, it's going to tend back to this level. So now we can think about the demand curve. And the demand curve is just the sum of what people in this economy want to buy at any given price level. Now, when I say people, I'm really thinking about 4 different groups. I'm thinking about consumers, businesses, the government, and people from outside of Pawnee who may want to purchase some of Sweetums' products and bring them to another town. And so aggregate demand is made up of those 4 components: consumption by households, investment by businesses, spending by government, and net exports. Now keep in mind that Pawnee's GDP is entirely made up of this candy product, right? So what people in Pawnee are going to consume is going to be made up not only of this, but also of some imports from out of town of other kinds of products. Now, of course, if the price of this candy product is really high, all of these groups are going to tend to reduce their consumption of it. And then as the price falls, they're going to want to consume more. And so the aggregate demand curve is going to be downward sloping. Now, the aggregate demand curve describes how much people want to buy of that product at a given price level. Now, of course, this can change with a variety of factors. So one of the factors we often think about is consumer expectations of future income. So even conditional on where they are right now and what the prices are right now, if people feel like their incomes are rising, that they're going to be getting richer over time, if they're optimistic, then they might buy more at a given price level. So if consumer expectations improve, then what we would expect is to see the demand curve shift to the right. Another thing that can affect the aggregate demand curve here is what's going on in the economy outside of Pawnee, right? So here we're just modeling Pawnee's economy, but you could think about a situation where maybe other cities in the US are getting richer and they start wanting to buy more of Pawnee's products at a given price level. That's going to increase the exports piece of aggregate demand and cause the curve to shift to the right as well. The output and price level in Pawnee is going to be determined by the intersection of the short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand curves. Now, in principle, this can occur anywhere on the graph in the short run, and then a variety of adjustment mechanisms will kick in to get us back to that long-run aggregate supply curve. And we'll save that discussion for after we've thought a bit about the impact of the tax. For now, I'm just going to assume that the Pawnee economy is initially at the long-run equilibrium, which means that the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curves intersect at a level of output that is on the long-run aggregate supply curve. Now we're ready to think through what happens if Leslie is successful in passing the soda tax. Now, the episode is really about a tax on soda specifically, but I'm going to assume that it applies to all products that have a high level of sugar content, so that they're going to affect our main producer here, which is Sweetums Candy. Okay, so let's assume that this is a 20% tax levied on the producers of sugary goods. We're also going to assume that the tax applies whether Sweetums sells its goods in Pawnee or outside of Pawnee, just because I don't want to have to think too hard about different price levels in different places. Now, if the government is charging a 20% tax on the sale of each good, then that is going to raise Sweetums' costs by 20%. And that means that they are going to require a 20% higher price in order to sell each unit of candy. And so what that means is that the price level for consumers of Sweetums goods has risen by 20%. And so we represent that by a shift in the aggregate supply curve. When the short run aggregate supply curve shifts in, we're going to wind up at a new lower level of output and a higher price level. Now, consumers here are buying less sugary stuff because the price is higher. That's moving along the aggregate demand curve. What has shifted here is the cost to the main producer in the town, which means that they require a higher price in order to sell each unit. And so we end up at a new intersection point with lower output and higher prices. Now, we can't see anything about the labor market directly on this graph, but what we do know is that as we've moved to this lower level of output, Sweetums has had to lay off some workers. They're now producing less, so they don't need as many workers. What that means is that unemployment in Pawnee is going to go up. And so we have a higher unemployment rate in equilibrium. Unemployment is now going to be higher than what we think of as the natural unemployment rate, which is the unemployment rate that results from people moving around from job to job or maybe having a skill mismatch with employers. On top of that, we've now added this cyclical component, which is induced by the soda tax. Now, let's think about how the economy adjusts back to its long-run aggregate supply curve. So there's really two ways that this could happen. The first one is through the labor market. Because we have higher unemployment in Pawnee now, there may be some downward pressure on the wages of workers at the Sweetums factory. The company now has the power to go to its workers and say, hey, there are all these unemployed folks who are willing to take your job. I'm going to give you a pay cut. If the workers get a pay cut, then the aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the right. And this is because the costs of production are now lower. Notice that if the economy adjusts in this way, then the government hasn't achieved its goal of reducing the consumption of sugary products. The decline in wages exactly offset the increase in costs from taxes, and so the economy is producing exactly what it was before and selling it at the same price. Another way for the economy to adjust would be if the aggregate demand curve shifted to the right. And the most likely reason for this to happen would be for the government to pass some sort of stimulus package, right? So if you're the government of Pawnee right now, you're looking at high unemployment rates and declining incomes, and you probably want to do something about that. Now, because this economy only produces one thing, government stimulus is going to take the form of the government just going out and buying Sweetums products, and that's going to directly increase aggregate demand. If the economy adjusts in this way, the net result is that the price level is going to be higher, but the real output is going to be the same as it was before. Now, whether the government has achieved its goal of reducing consumption of sugary products depends on what they do with the Sweetums products that they bought in their stimulus package. If they decide to just throw them out, then yeah, Pawnee residents are going to be consuming less sugar in this new equilibrium. If, however, they decide to redistribute those products, they've purchased them and they're going to give them out, then we end up at exactly the same outcome that we had before, where the economy is producing just as much sugary stuff and people in Pawnee are consuming it.